Have you ever noticed how some stories from the past never really disappear? They just keep coming back, again and again, each time sounding a little different depending on who is telling them. It's loud, it's emotional, and it remains just as attention-grabbing today as ever when people talk about that rock music era. Names like Victoria Taft and Mattix sometimes emerge alongside the musicians, artists, and personalities who defined it, offering a first-hand perspective on a unique moment in cultural history. The 1970s rock and roll world has become the stuff of legend. Behind the headlines, however, were real people whose story helped define the era of rock and roll. Let's go deeper. Victoria Taft is remembered today as a publicity agent and rock groupie connected to the Doors in the late 1960s. Friends described her as an elegant, effervescent golden girl, an extravagant beauty with a presence people didn't forget. She came from an entertainment family. Her father worked as a cameraman on sets for Paramount, Columbia, and MGM. And later on, the classic show Happy Days, and she grew up around studios before she ever stepped into the rock world herself. But in a broader sense, she also represents something very important in this discussion reflection. She represents a voice from inside that era, someone whose own life brushes up against the questions we still ask about the past. Beyond her years close to the Doors, she went on to work as an actress and model, appearing in dozens of films, television shows, and plays over the years. And she later wrote a book about her travels through Europe. Hers is not a story frozen in one decade, it's stretched across an entire life in entertainment. What really happened in past cultural eras? How did society view fame, youth, and music back then? And what have we learned since that time? Because history is never just a collection of events. It is an interpretation. It is a memory. It is perspective. Now when we turn to Mattix, we step into a parallel story, one deeply connected to the rock and roll scene of the 1970s. That was a time when music was not just entertainment, it was identity. It shaped how people dressed, how they spoke, how they lived, and even how they saw the world. Rock stars were not just performers. They were symbols of freedom, rebellion, and escape. And in that environment, many people found themselves drawn into a world that felt larger than life. But here's something important to understand. Every cultural moment looks different depending on how close you are to it. From the outside, it can look glamorous, exciting, even magical. But from within, it can be far more complicated. Mattix is often discussed as part of that 1970s rock culture, a time when young fans and musicians moved in close circles. And the boundaries between admiration and lifestyle often became unclear. Mattix moved effortlessly through Beverly Hills' elite social circles, where she became friends with Victoria Taft. But what truly cemented her place in rock and roll lore was her high-profile relationship with Jimmy Page, the legendary guitarist of Led Zeppelin. That world had a different rhythm, a different set of expectations, and in many ways, a lack of structure that would be seen very differently today. But instead of rushing to judge it, we need to understand it. Because understanding history is not about approval or disapproval, it is about awareness. So let's ask a simple question. Why did rock and roll have such a powerful pull during that time? Was it just the music? Or was it something deeper? Think about it. In the 1970s, there was no internet, no social media, no constant digital exposure to celebrities. Fame felt distant, but also strangely accessible if you were in the right place at the right time. And rock music created a world where everything felt amplified. The sound was louder. The personalities were bigger. The lifestyle seemed freer. For many young people, it wasn't just about listening to music, it was about becoming part of it. And that is where the culture around groupies, backstage access, and close relationships with rock stars became part of the larger story of that era. Mattix's name appears in discussions of that world not as a simple character, but as part of a much bigger cultural moment that people still try to understand today. Because that era wasn't black and white. Now, Victoria Taft's role in this story is different. She represents that world from the inside, someone who lived alongside it rather than simply observing it from a distance. She was there in the rooms and backstage corridors where the Doors moved through their rise, at a moment when the band itself was becoming one of the defining sounds of the era. That kind of closeness to a moment in music history is its own form of memory, lived rather than studied. Because when we look at the past, we are always doing it through a modern lens. And that lens changes everything. What was once seen as normal can now be questioned. What was once ignored can now be discussed openly. And what was once celebrated can now be analysed more critically. That is how culture evolves over time. So when we connect these two names, Victoria Taft and Laurie Mattix, we are not just talking about individuals. We are talking about two different ways of understanding history. One is lived experience from a past era. The other is modern reflection on that era. And in between those two perspectives lies something very important. The truth is rarely simple. Now let's slow down and think about the bigger picture. The 1970s rock and roll scene was not just about music. It was about transformation. It was about a generation trying to break away from tradition and create something new. It was about freedom, creativity, experimentation, and rebellion. But it was also about excess, blurred boundaries, and a lack of structure that sometimes led to complicated outcomes. And that combination, freedom and chaos, is what makes the era so fascinating even today. Because it represents both the best and most difficult parts of cultural change. Now imagine being inside that world. The music is everywhere. The concerts are massive. The energy is intense. Every night feels like something important is happening. It feels like a moment that will never end. But of course, all eras end. And when they do, what remains is memory. And memory is never perfect. It changes over time. It becomes shaped by stories, interviews, documentaries, and public discussions. That is why people today still try to understand what that era really meant. Was it a golden age of music? Was it a time of cultural freedom? Or was it something more complicated than either of those descriptions? The answer depends on who you ask. And that is exactly why stories connected to Victoria Taft matter. In these discussions, they help remind us that real people lived inside that history, not just the headlines about it. A name like hers carries a whole life behind it. The family she came from, the work she did long after her rock and roll years, and the way she was remembered by the people who knew her best. Not to rewrite history, but to understand it more clearly. And stories connected to Laurie Mattix remind us that behind cultural moments are real people who lived through experiences that were part of a much larger world they could not fully control. That is an important reminder. Because when we talk about history, it is easy to focus on fame, music, and public stories. But behind every era are individuals, each with their own perspective, emotions, and memories. And that brings us to a deeper thought. Why do we still talk about the 1970s rock era so much today? Maybe it is because it represents a time when music felt more raw and powerful. Maybe it is because it represents freedom in a way that feels different from today's highly connected world. Or maybe it is because it forces us to think about how culture changes over time and how we change with it. When we look back, we are not just comparing music, we are also comparing the worlds they lived in. We are asking what audiences admired then and what they admire now. We are looking at how success was measured, how artists were expected to behave, and how culture shaped their careers. That comparison can be uncomfortable at times, but it is also valuable. Now let's bring it all together. Victoria Taft represents a thread connected to the rock world of the Doors. A life that began backstage in the late 1960s and carried on through decades of work in entertainment afterward. Laurie Mattix represents connection to a powerful cultural past. And the 1970s rock and roll era represents the space where music, fame, freedom, and complexity all collided. Together, they form a larger conversation about how we remember culture. Not as something fixed, but as something evolving. Something we continue to interpret, something we continue to question, and something that still influences the world we live in today. Even now, when you hear a classic rock song on the radio, you are hearing more than music. You are hearing a piece of history, a piece of emotion, a piece of a world that still echoes through modern culture. And that is why these stories continue to matter. Because they are not just about the past. They are about understanding the present. So here's the final question. When you listen to the music of that era, do you hear just songs, or do you hear a story still trying to be understood? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel, because there are still many stories to explore, stories about music, culture, fame. And until next time, keep listening, keep questioning, because every song carries a memory, and every memory carries a meaning.